Try to remember the moment before you existed, not your earliest childhood memory. Go further back than that. Try to recall the silence before you were ever born, the nothing that came before the first flicker of your own awareness. You can't do it. Nobody can. And here's what's strange about that. We treat the question of what happens after death as one of the great unsolved mysteries of human existence, something people debate, fear, build entire religions around. But almost nobody asks the mirror version of that same question. What happened before you arrived? Where exactly was you before you were anywhere at all? Ancient humans asked this question constantly, and the answers they came up with reveal something genuinely surprising about how the human mind handles non-existence in both directions. Here's where things get interesting, because this question is harder than it looks. Death feels conceptually manageable, even when it's emotionally devastating, because you have a reference point. You exist now. You can imagine that existence ending. There's a before and an after, and you're standing in the before, looking forward. But the period before your birth offers no such reference point. There was no version of you standing somewhere, waiting, watching the world happen without you. As far as biology can tell us, there was simply no you to be in any state at all. Not absent, not waiting, not anywhere. Just absence so complete it doesn't even qualify as absence in any way your mind can grasp. Philosophers actually have a name for the strange asymmetry in how humans treat these two forms of non-existence. We tend to view the non-existence after death as tragic, something to mourn, fear, or fight against. But most people feel almost nothing about the equally vast non-existence before birth, even though, logically, both represent the exact same condition, a universe operating perfectly well without you in it. Think about that for a moment. You spent billions of years not existing before you were born, and it caused you no suffering whatsoever because there was no you present to suffer it. Yet the much shorter span of non-existence after death often produces deep, genuine anxiety. What most people don't realize is that ancient cultures grappled with this exact asymmetry thousands of years before modern philosophy gave it a name. So how did ancient humans actually answer this? Overwhelmingly, by refusing to accept that nothing happened before birth at all. Across remarkably different cultures, separated by oceans and centuries with no shared contact, a strikingly similar idea kept reappearing: the belief that some part of a person existed before conception, waiting somewhere, in some form, for the right moment to enter the world. In several indigenous Australian traditions, spirit children were believed to exist in the land itself, waiting in particular sacred sites before entering a mother's body to be born. Among some West African belief systems, certain children were considered reincarnations of recently deceased ancestors, arriving back into the family line rather than appearing from nothing. In ancient Greek philosophy, Plato proposed that the soul existed before birth in a realm of pure forms, carrying knowledge into life that birth itself caused us to forget. Hindu and Buddhist traditions developed entire frameworks around the soul moving through cycles of existence long before any individual birth. Here's the genuinely strange part. These belief systems had no contact with each other, developed independently across entirely different continents, and yet they converged on a remarkably similar structural idea, that pure non-existence before birth was somehow less acceptable, less believable than the idea of some prior state of being. Why would so many unrelated cultures resist the simplest explanation that there was simply nothing, and instead build elaborate frameworks insisting something was already there? This is where the explanation shifts from anthropology into psychology, and it might be the most revealing part of the entire question. Just as the human mind struggles to genuinely simulate its own absence after death, it appears to struggle equally with imagining true non-existence before life. Some researchers studying cognition and consciousness argue that the human brain may be structurally biased toward assuming continuity, treating identity as something that must extend backward as well as forward, rather than simply switching on from nothing. Here's an experiment worth sitting with. Ask someone to imagine nothing, genuinely nothing, no observer, no awareness, no waiting consciousness anywhere. Most people find this nearly impossible to hold in their mind for more than a second or two before some version of an observing self sneaks back into the picture. If your mind has difficulty generating true non-existence even as an abstract thought experiment, imagine how much harder that concept becomes when applied to something as personal and significant as your own existence. Ancient humans weren't being irrational by inventing waiting souls and prior lives. They may have been doing the only thing a self-aware mind is actually capable of doing when confronted with its own absence, filling the gap with continuity, because true absence isn't something the human brain seems built to represent. And here's where the modern contrast becomes genuinely interesting. We like to think we've moved past these ancient frameworks, replaced spiritual waiting rooms with biological explanations, conception, cell division, embryonic development. And scientifically, that's accurate. But emotionally, many of the same instincts persist. Expecting parents often describe a felt sense of their child's identity, personality, even preferences, long before birth, sometimes before conception is even confirmed. Baby names get chosen, nurseries get decorated, entire emotional relationships begin forming around a person who, biologically speaking, doesn't exist yet in any individuated sense. We didn't eliminate the ancient instinct, we just stopped calling it a soul. So here's the asymmetry worth sitting with as we bring this together. We've built entire religions, philosophies, and rituals around managing the fear of non-existence after death. Elaborate funeral practices, belief systems promising continuation, centuries of philosophical debate about what, if anything, comes next. But the equally vast non-existence before birth gets comparatively little of that same anxious attention, even though it represents the identical condition, a universe functioning entirely without your presence in it. Ancient humans, in their own way, noticed this imbalance long before modern philosophy gave it a name, and many of them tried to correct it, insisting that the soul, the spirit, the self, in some form, was present on both sides of the boundary, not just lingering meaningfully after death, but waiting meaningfully before birth too. Maybe that wasn't naivety. Maybe it was an attempt at fairness, applying the same comforting logic equally to both directions of the unknown, rather than reserving all our existential dread for only one side of it. Here's the thought worth carrying with you after all of this. For billions of years before you were born, the universe carried on entirely without you, stars forming, civilizations rising and falling, and not 1 second of it caused you any pain, because there was no version of you present to feel the absence. That span of non-existence was, in every measurable sense, identical to whatever waits after death, and yet you were never afraid of it. You don't lie awake at night mourning the centuries you missed before your birth. It simply never occurs to most people as something worth fearing at all. Maybe that's the real lesson hiding inside this question. The terror so many humans feel about non-existence isn't really about non-existence itself. It's about loss, about the idea of losing something you currently have, awareness, connection, the people around you. But the non-existence before birth never asked you to lose anything. There was nothing yet to lose. No hands to let go of, no light to watch fade, no version of you standing at the edge of it, bracing for the moment to arrive. Ancient humans built entire belief systems trying to make both sides of that mystery feel a little less empty, reaching for souls, spirits, and prior lives, not because they had proof, but because the silence on either side of a single human life was too vast to leave completely unanswered. And maybe the most honest thing we can take from all of it isn't an answer. It's the realization that you have already, once before, in the fullest, most complete sense possible, been exactly where you're afraid of returning to. And it was, somehow, without effort, without fear, without you even being there to notice, perfectly fine.